This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Right, good evening everyone. Very warm welcome to the Institute of Germanic and Romance Studies. Nice to see so many friends, old and new here, and friends we haven't met yet, as we say. This is obviously a special event in our calendar, the Malcolm Bowie Memorial Lecture, which we share biennially with Queen Mary. So I welcome my colleagues from there, and also, of course, a warm welcome to Alison Finch, who has joined us tonight as well. The breadth and depth of Malcolm Bowie's research and of his contribution to French studies is very well known, and perhaps at this point I can make a plug for a publication which came out 2 or 3 years ago, of essays in French studies in memory of Malcolm Bowie, or When Familiar Meanings Dissolve, edited by Naomi Siegel and Jill Rye, which was a product of a conference, a memorial conference held in his memory at the IGRS. But if I can just share a couple of memories I have about Malcolm Bowie, but also an appreciation of him. For me, I was always very struck and impressed by what I might call his double duty. He combined a very profound commitment to French studies, but also a questioning of it and a questioning of its boundaries. Also, what was perhaps slightly well known to those who knew him less well, I did not know him very well, I have to say, was that he had a rather fun side as well, a rather frivolous side, which came out, and which I illustrate in 2 memories I have of him. One was, and this illustrates his broad-mindedness and willingness to probe the boundaries. The first Lesbian and Gay Studies Conference in Modern Languages was held at the then Institute of Romance Studies in 1991. And I distinctly remember Malcolm's euphoria and glee at the huge numbers of people who had turned out to this event. And I'm sure he was proud not only of the academic success of the conference, but I can now very well understand, and I'm sitting sort of partly in his shoes, let me put it that way, that he was delighted at the financial consequences for the Institute of having such a huge audience. So I now understand his glee even more. The other thing I can recall is, which is a segue into introducing our speaker this evening, is an evening at Pizza Paradiso at about the same time, which took place following a paper given by tonight's speaker, where he taught me, by the end of the meal, as you can imagine, he taught me and others the art of setting fire to rolled up amaretti wrapping paper and sending them up to the ceiling like Chinese lanterns. So a very good time was had then as well. This brings me to introducing this evening's speaker, Toril Moy, who if we look Toril up on the internet at Duke University, we get a series of titles: Professor of Literature and Romance Studies, Professor of English and Theatre Studies, and Director of the Centre for Philosophy, Arts and Literature. Her work will be well known to many of you. I'd have to say that I think it was the evening of the amaretti wrapping paper, but it was also the evening where Toril gave a paper on Simone de Beauvoir, and this was the run-up to the completion and publication of her important work, Simone de Beauvoir, The Making of an Intellectual Woman, published in 1993, about which I recall Malcolm saying that this was the book we were all waiting for, as indeed it was. It's obviously a landmark piece of scholarship on Simone de Beauvoir, which was republished and with a new edition in 2008 to mark the centenary of the birth of Simone de Beauvoir. I can mention other texts, perhaps also her book on Ibsen, Henrik Ibsen and the Birth of Modernism, Art, Theatre and Philosophy. One of the things I very much enjoy about Toril's work is that her thought is constantly evolving and changing. So even when she returns to texts and authors that she's written about before, she returns to them afresh with new ideas, new approaches, and I suspect this is what we're going to be treated to this evening. So can I please introduce Toril Moy. The title of her lecture this evening is Simone de Beauvoir and the Metaphysical Novel, Literature, Philosophy and the Question of the Other in L'Invité, she came to stay.
Well, first of all, let's see, can you all hear me? So I am delighted to be here today. I want to thank Bill Marshall, my old friend, for inviting me to give this year's Malcolm Bowie Memorial Lecture. I want to give Alison Finch a special thanks for being here. I am delighted to do this lecture in honor of Malcolm Bowie, since I was lucky enough to meet Malcolm in the early 1980s. I knew Malcolm particularly in the 1980s because in 1989 I left England to go to America, so after that I only saw him rarely. In the early 1980s I had just arrived in Britain from Norway and I was just beginning to write a book on feminist theory. I couldn't find a decent job, this was the early Thatcher years, and quickly discovered that my book project, which became a book called Sexual Textual Politics, was not a job recommendation for me at the time. To meet Malcolm then was such a relief. Here, finally, was a brilliant, famous, established professor, in my eyes, of course. I mean, he wasn't that old, quite frankly, but I thought he was like, he was a professor. And he actually took an interest in my work. He encouraged it. He actually gave me a sense that it was worthwhile persevering, jobless and all. And I know I wasn't the only one he encouraged. He was legendary for his encouragement of younger colleagues, and I am and I will always be grateful to him for his support at that time. Obviously, when one is invited to give a talk in memory of someone so exceptional as Malcolm Bowie, it's hard to find the right topic. He was essentially capable of speaking well on anything in French studies, plus he was also a great theorist. So it was really difficult for me to come down on the right topic here. But then I realized today is the 8th of March. It's International Women's Day, so I congratulate you all for celebrating the Women's Day by coming to a talk on, of course, Simone de Beauvoir. No subject could be better for a talk in French studies on the 8th of March. So I have provided a handout. You should have one. If not, I see a few lying around. The handout is not crucial, but it's good to have when I get to particularly the long quote. There's a particularly long quote I want to look at in detail. And on the handout there's also various names and references and so on. So the talk then is called Simone de Beauvoir and the Metaphysical Novel, and it is really about what the title says it is about, literature, philosophy, and the question of the other in L'Invité. Let me begin with a short presentation of L'Invité. Beauvoir began work on the novel in 1937 and finished it in 1941. The book was published at the end of 1943. The action begins in October 1938, just after the Munich Accords, and ends roughly a year later, after the declaration of war in September 1939, but well before the defeat of France in 1940. The plot is simple. An established couple, Françoise and Pierre, invites a young woman, Xavier, to leave the provinces and join them in Paris. Soon the three of them decide to form something they call a trio. The experience ends badly. Xavier discovers that Françoise has slept with her boyfriend Gerbert. Rather than face Xavier's judgment of her behavior, Françoise then kills Xavier. I've given away the plot, I'm afraid. All except 2 chapters are told from Françoise's point of view in the third person singular. No chapter is told from Xavier's point of view. I refer to this novel as L'Invité, partly we're in French studies here, but also because the English title, She Came to Stay, makes it look as if Xavier imposes herself on Françoise and Pierre, whereas in fact they invite her to join their lives, and that's a crucial nuance, I think. And you have the subtitles of my sections also on the handout, but the first one is called In Defense of Literature, or Beauvoir Between Literature and Philosophy. Since the early 1990s, there has been a Simone de Beauvoir revival in academia. In the 1980s, the dominant view was that Simone de Beauvoir was irrelevant to feminist theory and philosophy and uninteresting as a novelist and writer. Happily, this has changed. Today, thanks to the contributions of many brilliant scholars, there's a much wider and deeper appreciation of Beauvoir's importance as a philosopher and feminist theorist. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a similar resurgence of academic interest in Beauvoir as a literary writer. Obviously, I'm not saying there's nothing. There are excellent exceptions, but on the whole, French studies is not preoccupied, are not preoccupied with Beauvoir's literary work, I think. Moreover, most literary analysis of Beauvoir's writing have not focused on philosophical questions. Conversely, philosophers who read Beauvoir's fiction tend not to take literary questions into account. They look to them as illustrations of some philosophy or other. It may look then as if the disciplinary division of labor in the academy, like the philosophers in one department, the literary critics in another, prevent us from doing justice to Beauvoir's own insistence that, for her, philosophy, literature, and life are inextricably intertwined. From a very young age, Beauvoir was passionately interested in philosophy, as her student diaries from 1926 to 1930 amply demonstrate. But the same diaries also show that literature was at least as important to her. Nothing else in the diaries reaches the intensity of her enthusiasm for the correspondence between the two young writers, Alain Fournier, author of Le Grand Môle, and Jacques Rivière. Compared to them, Henri Bergson, a philosopher who actually was literary too because he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1927, is a mere shadow in Beauvoir's mind. Beauvoir herself experienced philosophy bodily and emotionally, she writes. In 1925, at the age of 18, she notes in her diary that she genuinely feels ideas and that she elaborates her ideas painfully with all my being. In 1927, she noted that the difference between herself and her fellow student and friend, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, was that, quotes, the problems that he lives in his mind, I live them with my arms and my legs. In 1943, she endowed the heroine of L'Invité with exactly the same qualities. At one point, her lover Pierre says admiringly to Françoise, "You have an exceptional capacity to live an idea, body and soul." Françoise replies, "But for me, an idea is not theoretical. One has to experience it." Well, we can have a discussion about translation afterwards. The French here is "ça s'éprouve." So live it out, try it out, experience it, what have you. If it remains theoretical, it has no value. In 1948, she succinctly declared that, in truth, there is no divorce between philosophy and life. These quotations are well known. They show that Beauvoir's passion for philosophy was not primarily academic. Her philosophical interest was grounded in a need to understand her own experience, which meant to her finding words for it, make it available both to herself and to others. A philosopher who takes a real interest in ordinary experience, as the existentialists did, could very well write in a fairly literary way, though. For example, Sartre's writing in Being and Nothingness uses concrete examples from lived experience all the time and is in many ways a brilliant example of the literary potential of existentialist philosophy. Think of the description of the woman who has gone on a first date, of the waiter who plays the role of being a waiter, of the man spying through a keyhole, and so on. So you could ask, well, if she was so interested in literature and philosophy and she could write that kind of literary philosophical works, why didn't she just become a philosopher? In my book, The Making of an Intellectual Woman, I have shown that there were quite a number of cultural and sociological factors that pushed her in the direction of choosing literature. And in fact, ever after she passed the agrégation in philosophy, her big ambition was to write literature. First, the stories in the collection called When Things of the Spirit Come First, which was not accepted by the publishers at the time, so it wasn't published until 1979. And then, at long last, her first novel, L'Invité. Beauvoir actually struggled for 14 years with her literary writing before that novel was published. So the question then is why, everyone said she was deeply talented for writing philosophy, yet she rather struggles with unpublished drafts for 14 years before she publishes that first novel, L'Invité. So the question then is, what did Beauvoir herself find so valuable in literature? In her 1946 essay, Literature and Metaphysics, she provides part of an answer at least. She writes, one doesn't do metaphysics as one does mathematics. To do metaphysics, she writes, is to be metaphysical. It is to realize in oneself the metaphysical attitude. And by metaphysical attitude, she means something like beginning with an attitude of wonder at one's own specific being in the world, an attitude which leads to an attempt to understand one's being, to grasp it in its totality. She gives the example of little children who are overcome by the experience of me being here, ipseite, as she calls it. And this refrain of I am here, I am me here, separate, special, in this moment, at this time, you find in almost all her novels. And it certainly is the experience of Françoise on the first page of L'Invité when she walks through the dark theatre at night. And this quote you have on the handout as well. When she was not there, the smell of dust, the half-light, the forlorn solitude, all this did not exist for anyone. It did not exist at all. She alone released the meaning of these abandoned places, of these slumbering things. She was there and they belonged to her. The world belonged to her. If Beauvoir had written, I find myself in an empty theatre. I have the impression that I released the meaning of that abandoned place. This could have gone straight into an existential essay. Just compare it to Sartre's, let us imagine that moved by jealousy, curiosity or vice, I have just glued my ear to the door and looked through a keyhole. What makes Sartre's text philosophy and Beauvoir's literature? As far as I can see, it certainly isn't the language per se, but it's rather the way they use these observations. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre immediately goes on to explain the philosophical implications of the keyhole scene. In L'Invité, Beauvoir withholds further analysis and leaves us, the readers, to work out for ourselves what's going on with Françoise. We never learn anything more about Sartre's I. It exists only for philosophical purposes. On the other hand, we learn quite a lot about Françoise. She becomes a real character for her. We learn about her for us. We learn about her tastes, her friends, what she enjoys doing, how she's perceived by others, what her goals and projects are, and so on. Her status as a fictive character gives her a freedom, a potential for different meanings that the phenomenological I in an essay just doesn't have. Beauvoir loved the unpredictability, the uncertainty about the outcome characteristic of this kind of literary writing. For her, to write a novel was not to For her, to write a novel was to, I put in a not, which is perfectly unmotivated. I don't know what kind of unconscious, total slip of the pen here. For her, to write a novel was to invite the reader to join her on what she calls an authentic adventure of the mind. As a partner in the adventure, moreover, the reader can fail the book. Like there's a claim on the reader in this kind of writing. You may refuse to participate sincerely in the experience the author is trying to involve him in, Beauvoir writes. But when both parties, author and reader, participate in equal measure, then nothing, not even philosophy, will be more powerful than a novel. Beauvoir writes, a metaphysical novel, honestly read and honestly written, provides a disclosure of existence unequaled by any other mode of expression. Now, this is a very strong statement. A metaphysical novel is unequal to any other mode of expression when it comes to disclosing existence. If we are to take Beauvoir seriously, we should at least entertain the idea that fiction may be superior to philosophy when it comes to the task of disclosing existence. And given that disclosing existence is a fair description of Beauvoir's own philosophical ambition, it follows that we can't expect to discover the full range and depth of Beauvoir's philosophy if we don't include her novels, travel writing, and memoirs as critical sources of philosophical insight. But if we do so, if we now think we got to read the novels, etc., for philosophical insight, then the point can't be simply to impose a set of existing philosophical ideas onto the literary text. On the contrary, then it becomes crucial to begin with the literary text's own concepts, to let the work teach us how to read it, to paraphrase Stanley Cavell. Ideally, then, Beauvoir scholars should be as skilled in literary criticism, literary history, and in aesthetics as they are in philosophy. In other words, we should emulate Beauvoir's own interdisciplinarity in our own work. So that was the preamble, or rather the setting for why philosophy actually matters in her literary text. It's her own position that this is the case, and when you start looking, you can see why she thinks it. So at this point, the rest of my talk takes this form. I'm going to say something about literary history in France in the 1940s that I'm finding quite interesting, and insofar as it pertains to L'Invité, and then I'm going to turn to L'Invité proper. So now we are at L'Invité and the metaphysical novel in France in the 1940s. That Beauvoir in fact uses her first novel as a model or as a mode of philosophical investigation is beyond doubt. A couple of years ago, my friend and colleague Anne Jefferson in New College in Oxford told me that she had discovered frequent references to something called the Metaphysical Novel as part of her research for a larger work on the French novel in the 1940s. She's having a much wider canvas. I'm just zooming in here on the metaphysical novel because Anne mentioned it as part of a number of other things, but I immediately thought, and we discussed this at some length, that Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote an essay devoted to L'Invité called Metaphysics and the Novel in March 1945. Maurice Blanchot discusses philosophy and the novel in his wartime reviews of Sartre and Beauvoir, which I will return to. And as we have seen, Beauvoir herself wrote Literature and Metaphysics in 1946. So I suddenly realized, I think I had thought until that moment that, well, metaphysics is just what they call philosophy, and didn't reflect on what is this thing about titling essays, literature and metaphysics and so on. But talking to Anne, I realized that it may just conceivably have been a bit more than that they were referring to ongoing discussions at the time, which I hadn't really realized. And that gives a different background for reading the novel as part of the argument here. In her research, Anne Jefferson discovered that the occupation was actually a period of intense reflection on the novel. In 1943, Jean Prévost, a writer and critic active in the resistance, edited a special issue of the journal Confluence, which was called Problems of the Novel. Interest in the topic was such that in spite of the paper shortages, the issue was republished as a book in 1946, 2 years after the editor's untimely death in a German ambush. Several contributors to the special issue of Confluence say that they think the center of the gravity of the novel now has moved from realism to philosophy. It's very interesting to see that they say that in around 1943. But this, at the time, seems not to have given rise to much debate. In fact, Anne Jefferson shows that the 1940s were not a particularly doctrinaire period in French literature and literary criticism. While there was a general consensus that the novel was becoming a key genre, a site for reflection on the new historical era that everyone agreed at the time had begun around 1939 or 40, there was no dominant school and no special insistence on the need for radical formal innovations, nor was there a self-declared movement promoting metaphysical novels. That is, there were none of those culture war fronts that we would get in the 50s, for example, or late 40s. I'll come to that. Critics, as far as I can see, critics use the terms philosophical and metaphysical novels to mean much the same thing. The word metaphysical seems to have become more prevalent in the immediate post-war period, like 1945-46 and thereabouts. But it looks to me as if the term metaphysical novel disappears along with the desire for philosophical novels a few years later, maybe by the late 1940s. If this is right, my guess would be that Sartre's 1948 call for committed literature, littérature engagée, which he issued in What is Literature, displaced the older term. So now everyone who were interested in anything like a philosophical novel would now call it littérature engagée, because that became the catchword from about 48 onwards. And also, when Sartre started talking about committed literature, that prepared the ground for a true culture war, a standoff between the littérature engagée and the new novel, which reached something of a late high point in the grand meeting about literature at the Mutualité in Paris in December 1964, in which Sartre and Beauvoir debated members of the emerging journal Tel Quel, which I have written a short paper on that, which is, you can download it from my website, it's on the handout. It's a fascinating meeting where you could really see the front lines of the French cultural past, Beauvoir and Sartre, confronting the French contemporary avant-garde, tel quel, which had already, were just in position to move away from the nouveau roman into the more semiotic moment, or whatever I'm going to call it. So, but that was in 1964. Now we're back in the late 40s, or during the war, 1943. So the question then is, so there's a greater argument about literary history here which will emerge, which is that there's a whole category here, the metaphysical novel, that we do not recognize as historically specific, and that's what I'm trying to talk about here. What was the metaphysical novel? How does this category, poised as it is between literature and philosophy, help us to understand L'Invité? How does L'Invité help to shape that genre? I haven't finished working on these questions. Right now, for example, I've begun to wonder whether the French preoccupation with the philosophical novel in the 1940s might be a peculiarly French twist on literary modernism, to the point that it becomes part of something we can call more widely phenomenological modernism. I would think of people like Rilke and Virginia Woolf, for example. But if so, it would be a corrective to the usual theories of modernism, which always had a really hard time accounting for the French novel and theatre, but not for French poetry and art before the 1950s, when we get both Beckett's theatre, En attendant Godot, opened in Paris in 1953, and the new novel, of course. The result is that I think to this day we have a relatively poor conceptual understanding of the development of French literature around this time, 1930s and 1940s. As you all know, if you're in French studies, the French have never really used the term modernisme. It's coming in now, but it's not been something one says in France. And I want to add that when Beauvoir goes to America in 1947, in her book L'Amérique au jour le jour, she describes her, let's call them quarrels, with the members of the partisan review crowd, and it turns on the question of realism. It's like the partisan review people can't believe that the French like people like the crime writers and so on, and the French really like American realism. They even like John Stewart Steinbeck, which, as everyone knows, the partisan review crowd think was just a horrible old-fashioned realist. So there's something much more to be done with the question of realism and modernism around French culture in this period. But here's like a first little beginning. So if this, my hunch, that this could be this cultivation of the metaphysical novel is part of a kind of turn towards something that might be modernist, but not as the current more formalistic theories of modernism would recognize it, then what would follow from that is that first of all, when we explore the metaphysical novel, we may be bringing to light a repressed strand of modernism. Specifically, I suspect that later theorists of modernism mistake the philosophical novel or the metaphysical novel in France at this time for a species of realism. You know, they produce this huge category, realism, into which everything that's not formally experimental in evident ways is put. But if they do that, they conclude so too fast. As I'm now going to show, realism is not quite the word for what is going on in L'Invité. So what did the French at the time take the metaphysical novel to be? And what did they want from it? My impression is that the term was used in two ways. First, there was a fairly broad sense in which the phrase metaphysical novel meant a novel inspired by a tradition of philosophy from Kierkegaard. That tradition goes specifically from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche through phenomenology to existentialism. And the writers most frequently mentioned in all these essays from this tradition are Dostoevsky, Kafka, Sartre, and Camus. A second, somewhat narrower definition understands the metaphysical novel exclusively as phenomenological, and they mention only Husserl, Heidegger, and Sartre. So you have a broader definition and a narrower one. For some writers, the metaphysical novel appears to be a specific incarnation of the philosophical novel that came to the fore in France in the 40s, by which I mean some people talk about the philosophical novel generally and mention all kinds of European writers and so on, and then they use the term metaphysical about the French. But this is not a particularly stable, none of these definitions are particularly stable, and the two terms are often used interchangeably around, at least in the early 40s. A metaphysical novel shouldn't just be what they all agree on is that whatever it is, this kind of novel shouldn't just exemplify an already existing philosophy. That's crucial. It should be a creative contribution to thought in its own right. In an essay on Sartre's novels, Blanchot writes about the difference between exposition and discovery. The philosophical novel should not just set forth the known, it should discover the new. Jefferson notes that in the 1940s, a number of critics and writers expressed the wish to think in images and through characters of flesh and blood, rather than engage in bloodless reasoning. Camus writes at the end of The Myth of Sisyphus, the great novelists are philosophical novelists who write in images rather than in reasoned arguments. Camus more than implies that such writing makes for better philosophy than the turgid academic style used by professional philosophers. And the vogue for metaphysical novels, I think, helped to secure a positive reception of L'Invité. In fact, when I have done a lot of research on the reception of Simone de Beauvoir, and L'Invité gets the best reviews by far. Later on, when the existentialists become very politically controversial, any review of their fiction is hardly, they are very partisan for things to do, have very little to do with literature, so it's hard to rely on them. But in the publication of L'Invité towards the end of 1943 was pretty well received. Blanchot reviewed it as early as December 1943. His review of this novel is surely the first one that's preserved, at least that I could find. He doesn't use the term metaphysical, he talks about philosophical, and he calls L'Invité a novel grafted onto phenomenology, and praises Beauvoir for her philosophical ambitions. While any reader will recognize that this novel is both moving and natural, he writes, some will surely miss its distinctive project, which is not, and here I'm quoting him, the project is not to explore psychology or make characters come alive, but to illustrate in an apparently banal story a situation specific to man, or should we say human beings. The metaphysical novel thus takes as its central concern fundamental aspects of our existential situation, being, time, consciousness, the other, freedom, separation, and so on, and tries to convey the different attitudes a human being can assume in relation to these experiences. Beauvoir thinks of these attitudes as emotional or affective. She writes, through his joys, sorrows, resignations, revolts, fears, and hopes, each man realizes a certain metaphysical situation that defines him far more essentially than any of his psychological attitudes. Fundamentally, for the phenomenologist, the metaphysical novel's task was to unveil pure existence. Blanchot praises L'Invité by saying that I'm quoting, the essence of the book is not at all the mood or the jealousy of a person. Behind such individual features, there is his naked existence, his existence as a free consciousness and elusive power. And Merleau-Ponty speaks of the metaphysical novel as doing the same work as phenomenological philosophy, which, according to him, in his essay on L'Invité, attempts to capture an experience of the world which precedes all thought about the world. Now, this is quite a hard thing to swallow. I mean, how are you going to capture the experience of the world? I mean, are you supposed to have an experience that precedes all thought? So what kind of pure experience is this, and so on? Let's say that that's a huge philosophical question, even if whether it even makes sense to talk about such experience, and whether you could even capture it in words is quite another story. And I'm not even going to go there. I'm just registering now that that's what they thought they were doing back then. At least Merleau-Ponty and Blanchot seem close to thinking that. But then, what would that mean for writing a novel if that was what you were trying to do? So we can then begin by noting that any phenomenologist would agree that pure existence never does manifest itself outside human situations or outside the human meanings that we find in language. Existence is always incarnated, always situated in a human event. Beauvoir herself writes that beyond its psychological and social shape, every human event possesses a metaphysical signification. And this seems sort of rather easier to do in a novel. Describe a situation, bringing out its metaphysical meaning. But note that all of these theories talk about how the reader needs to know how to look for it, that the reader can go wrong, the reader may fail to see it, and so on. If Beauvoir simply can place Françoise in the right sort of situations, and that's the trick, finding out what situations would bring out her preoccupations. Existence can't escape the conditions of this world, in other words, and neither can the metaphysical novel. Now, this explains why the metaphysical novel appears so realistic and why it has to be written in a way that positively encourages a kind of double reading in which realism and metaphysics go hand in hand. Now, here is a key thing. I used the term double reading. That's a well-known term, of course, but here we must be careful to distinguish between the kind of double reading invited by the metaphysical novel. That's the kind of double reading in which the reader follows the writer on an adventure, as Beauvoir puts it. And that's one thing. And then what literary critics for a couple of generations now have called suspicious readings, as in the hermeneutics of suspicion, that's somewhat different as far as I can see. Because the idea here is not that there's a necessary conflict between something like surface realism and depth philosophy. That would be quite the wrong picture, because the philosophy is right there in the situations and in the words. And there's no implication that there's a conflict between the philosophy saying one thing and the realistic situation saying another. Well, maybe they do or maybe they don't, but there's no requirement that they should. Also, the whole idea of a picture of surface and depth that has been very influential in literary theory completely fails to capture the idea of the embodiment and situatedness of existence. Blanchot and Merleau-Ponty constantly draw attention to L'Invite's challenge to its readers. Blanchot warns that some readers will fail to see the metaphysical level. While L'Invité is simply and clearly constructed, he writes, it, and here I'm quoting him at some length, it obeys the whims of the reader, who will, according to his powers, discover a novel of manners, a psychological novel, or what it truly is, a novel about a human being who undergoes the tragic experience of the gaze of the other. It is quite possible that read as a novel of manners or for the plot, L'Invité will appear an unpleasant and empty work. This will be the fault of those who do not look for anything else in it. And in his essay on L'Invité, which was first published in Les Cahiers du Sud in March 1945, Merleau-Ponty also thinks it would be a complete mistake to take the drama in L'Invité to be psychological, which means realistic. To bring out the philosophical concerns of L'Invité without losing sight of its literary qualities, then, we must be attuned to the metaphysical dimension of the work, or we will be tempted to read it, as some indeed have, namely simply as an insipid psychological novel with a threadbare plot turning on the most commonplace jealousy between two women, or in an equally misguided way as a transparently autobiographical roman à clé, where Françoise is Beauvoir, Pierre is Sartre, and Xavier is Olga, and so on. Blanchot, Merleau-Ponty, and Beauvoir all agree that to read a metaphysical novel as if it were simply a psychological or social novel would be to miss the point. I suppose they mean that it would be like trying to read Camus' The Stranger as a character study or as a critique of the criminal justice system. It's not that it can't be done, in fact it has been done, but a reader who stops there would definitely fail to live up to the demands of the novel, according to our friends in the 1940s. At the same time, however, we can't simply try to purify the philosophy of the metaphysical novel by ignoring its social and psychological aspects, for that would again be to miss the point. This time the point that there's no such thing as an unembodied, unsituated, absolutely free-floating existential experience. I am me here and now has to be somewhere in particular and someone specific, or you can't say anything. The metaphysical novel then offers the reader plenty of opportunities to miss the adventure, as Cora Diamond puts it in a phrase finely resonant with Beauvoir's own invitation to the reader in Literature and Metaphysics, to share the author's sense of exploration and discovery, and to join her on an authentic adventure of the mind. Turning now to L'Invité, I can obviously not do a full reading, whatever a full reading is, because it's a very long novel and it's full of all kinds of exciting and interesting things. Instead, I will just turn to what I think is the most strikingly metaphysical passage in the novel, a passage in which Beauvoir sets out to convey Françoise's experience of pure otherness. The question now is whether we can follow her on this adventure. So the situation is that the trio has gone to a nightclub. It's a Spanish nightclub with flamenco dancers, where Xavier deliberately burns herself with a cigarette. As Xavier becomes totally absorbed by the experience, she's described as being in the grip of hysterical ecstasy. Françoise watches in horror. And I'm going to read, you have the quote on the handout, and I'm going to read it out. It's sort of my translation, but it's not quite, the translation isn't quite finished. I think it needs some more work, but it's where I'm at right now. And it's, of course, based on the published translation. I just did various things to it. This hostile presence, which had just betrayed itself in a lunatic smile, was coming closer and closer. There was no longer any way of avoiding its terrifying disclosure. Day after day, minute after minute, Françoise had fled the danger, but that was all over now. At last she had come face to face with this insurmountable obstacle which she had felt as a shadowy foreboding since her earliest childhood. Through Xavier's maniacal pleasure, through her hatred and jealousy, the scandal was unleashed. It was as monstrous and final as death. Facing Françoise, and yet apart from her, something existed like a sentence without appeal. Free, absolute, invincible, an alien consciousness loomed. It was like death, a total negation, an eternal absence, and still, through a shocking contradiction, this abyss of nothingness had the power to make itself present to itself, to exist completely for itself. It engulfed the entire universe, and Françoise, who had lost the world forever, was dissolving into a shapeless, infinite emptiness that no word, no image could ever define. Then I skip a bit, and then it continues. She, that's Françoise, could no longer move. Transfixed by Xavier, she considered with astonishment this body that allowed itself to be touched, and this beautiful face that concealed a scandalous presence. For a long time, Xavier had been a mere fragment of Françoise's life. Suddenly, she had become the only sovereign reality, and Françoise had only the pale consistency of an image. This is phenomenology in action. Beauvoir is trying to convey the experience of absolute otherness, situated beyond any kind of description or definition. This is, I think, an effort to do what Merleau-Ponty does mean to say when he speaks about attempting to describe a contact with the world which precedes all thought about the world. Blanchot writes that Françoise discovers, and I'm quoting Blanchot, the unjustifiable and therefore unbearable fact that facing her someone exists, someone who is like her, an inalienable consciousness, a pure presence, an indestructible reality, someone who sees her from the outside and against whom she is powerless with no way out. Of course, Françoise's experience doesn't arise in a void. It happens in a situation in which Françoise is feeling neglected by Pierre, who is entirely consumed by jealousy because Xavier spent the previous night dancing with Gerbert. Clearly, a reader unaware of the philosophical nature of Beauvoir's project, although it's very hard to read this passage and think, oh, no philosophy here, it's just how she thinks it is to go to a nightclub. She is a reader who somehow doesn't want to, should I say, take on this philosophy, might find Françoise's response to Xavier's self-mutilation a tad exaggerated. A few years ago, I gave a lecture in which I handed out this specific passage to the audience in a somewhat different context. Then a woman came up to me afterwards to say that she thought I should be careful about using this passage because there was something I really needed to know. And I said, oh, well, what's that? And she said, well, it's just bad writing. And when I asked why she thought so, she replied, nobody would actually think that. That's exactly the reaction that Blanchot anticipated, right? Read it as a psychological novel, and then you will, because Blanchot in fact stressed that common sense, as he calls it, will find ridiculous the upheaval this very simple experience causes and the dramatic truth in which it is embodied. So if you feel that that's what's going on, you are falling straight into the category that Blanchot prepared for you already. However realistic it may appear then, but there you can see, this is why I'm saying this is stretching our notions of what realism is supposed to be. And part of my whole sort of animus here is to get to the point where we can reconsider the existentialists as modern writers. Their own most admired writers were people on the one hand like Dashiell Hammett, but also Dos Passos and Faulkner. So there was very interesting input into their own type of modern writing. So, however realistic it may appear then, you can't just read this as a psychologically realistic narrative. In this scene, as in the final murder scene, Xavier is no longer this or that particular woman. She is the pure presence of the other, described later on in the novel in a Gothic imagery of fear and horror. Increasingly, Xavier's presence gives rise to images of sexual menace, suffocation, claustrophobia, and death, and evokes the fear of being swallowed, engulfed, poisoned, held down, choked, or strangulated. When Xavier turns into monstrous otherness, Françoise loses her own sense of being. As Xavier becomes the one sovereign reality, Françoise becomes insubstantial, a mere image on the verge of dissolving altogether. Her sense of herself as a subject is destroyed by her hypnotic submission to Xavier's menacing otherness. So Xavier then figures the other as unknown, as mystery, as horror. She provokes, and as a spectacle, she provokes a kind of aesthetic trance in Françoise, a complete absorption into an immensely threatening vision. Swallowed alive, Françoise dissolves. She is nothing, Xavier is everything. Beauvoir's horror vision of the appearance of the other contains no ethical vocabulary. Note that there's not a word that you can consider to do with ethics, like responsibility, for example, or something like that in this passage. In her version of events, pure alterity overwhelms and destroys the spellbound subject. L'Invité, on this level, L'Invité is an immense effort to represent the experience of pure otherness, or what some people call pure alterity, beyond all social and psychological categories, beyond language and identity, and so also beyond ethical categories. The result is a vision of the other as a diabolical force, which at the end of the first part of the novel leaves Françoise stricken by pneumonia, an experience that strips her of the last remnants of identity, reducing her to what the text notes as an inert mass, not even an organized body. So she literally falls apart. When Françoise recovers from her pneumonia, the only way out is to turn Xavier into the same kind of lifeless form by turning on the gas. And I note that, interestingly to me, the lungs, the organ of breath and voice, the organ of expression, identity, and signification, are attacked in both cases. So now I come to the end of the talk, the death of Xavier. So at the very end of the novel, Françoise goes to bed, knowing that she has turned on the gas in Xavier's room next door. Xavier is sleeping, but soon she will be dead. I should perhaps, in case you are interested in detective stories, explain why this is the perfect crime, which the idea is that she will get away with this. So the two women are sharing a flat in Paris. Well, the two men, Gerbert and Pierre, are at the front, they're at the front. They're mobilized. It's the drôle de guerre. So, and they use gas cooking rings to heat stuff on. So there's a gas. The gas enters the apartment in the kitchen. There's you can turn on or off the gas for the whole apartment. Each room has its own little gas ring, and there you turn it on and off as well. So what Françoise does is that she goes into Xavier's room and turns on the gas there. Obviously no gas comes out because it's turned off in the kitchen. So no problem there. But then Xavier takes a sleeping pill and goes to bed. So, and at that point, Françoise turns on the gas in the kitchen. So once Xavier is properly dead, she can just either turn it off again, but Xavier has locked the door on the inside, so it's perfect locked door mystery. What is interesting, and which I won't dwell on here, is how Françoise for quite a long time sits there and looks at this gas lever that she has turned on. She could turn it off again at any point. She could stop the whole thing there and then, but she doesn't. So here Xavier is then sleeping, and soon she will be dead. And here's part of the end of the novel. On the bed there still remained a living form, but it was already no one. There was no one any longer. Françoise was alone. Alone. She had acted alone as in death. One day Pierre would know, but even he would only know this act from the outside. Nobody could condemn or absolve her. Her act belonged to her alone. I want this. Her will was being done. Nothing separated her from herself anymore. She had chosen at last. She had chosen herself. Beauvoir herself has pointed out, and she actually uses the term, that this end is not realistic, in the sense that Françoise is not really a character capable of murder. Her last act in the novel is extraordinary, melodramatic, extreme, and almost purely metaphysical. While Beauvoir may have found an inspiration for the novel in Hegel's master-slave dialectic, as the epigraph to the novel implies, so the epigraph is each consciousness seeks the death of the other. This end does not lend itself, so you think because the epigraph is from Hegel, surely the novel must then demonstrate Hegel, but that would be to take a pre-existing philosophy and imposing it on the novel, right? So here if you think about it, this end does not lend itself to the idea that Françoise's killing of the other turns her into a Hegelian subject, either master or slave, capable of dealing with others in work and struggle. If it represents any stage in the dialectics, it has to be this first stage in which the soon-to-become subject fights the other to the death and somehow wins, but there it stops, for there's nothing dialectical about the end. This strengthens my conviction that Beauvoir's concern at the end of this amoral novel, as Merleau-Ponty approvingly calls it, is with absolute alterity understood as fundamentally violent and traumatic. In her memoirs, Beauvoir writes that the murder, the ultimate act of annihilation of the other, was an experience of separation. That is to say, an experience of herself as a separate and finite existence. This is true also for her protagonist. At the beginning of the novel, Françoise and Pierre think that they are one. They keep repeating, on ne fait qu'un, we are one, we are one, we are one. Although Pierre regularly has affairs, they don't matter to Françoise, since she genuinely only perceives the other women as insignificant specks on the edge of her own universe. In fact, Françoise is the wonderful example of a solipsist, but I'm not going to go there right now. It takes the experiment of the trio, and particularly the experience of Xavier's otherness, to teach her that other women exist with the same weight and intensity in the world as she herself does. Yet, at the end of the novel, Françoise's only solution to this discovery, so the problem then becomes, once you discover that there are others, Françoise is into one of this all or nothing. It's either she or me, I'm nothing, she exists, I exist, she can't exist situation. Whereas the task we all have in life is learning how to live with others. That's a different story. Françoise's only solution to this discovery is to murder her by stealthy gas. This is quite the opposite of facing her, whether we think of that with Levinas or with Cavell. She has reasserted her absolute supremacy by eradicating Xavier's consciousness, thus demonstrating that she has learned nothing at all about how to actually live with others. Françoise may know that others exist, but she remains incapable of acknowledging their otherness, and she can't even begin to acknowledge their pain, let alone her own part in causing their pain. It doesn't even occur to Françoise to feel for the powerless Xavier, who has to invent fictions about Pierre's undying love for her to keep going. Instead, she simply kills her. Sitting there on her bed, she has just turned on the gas. She could easily turn it off again, but she won't. Françoise, is not in pain. She shuts us out. At the end of L'Invité, I realized Françoise is no longer quite human. She's a philosophically illuminating monster. A novel about Françoise as an ethical agent situated in relation to particular others would be a completely different novel. It would be more or less The Blood of Others, the novel Beauvoir began to write in 1943 during the occupation and published in 1945. For Beauvoir, the turn to ethics and engagement meant turning away from metaphysical otherness and towards particular others, as she also makes quite clear in her 1944 essay Pyrrhus and Cineas. I'm not trying to say that The Blood of Others isn't a metaphysical novel, but that one is about responsibility. It's about the nature of action, which is a different question. Levinas writes that the encounter with the other causes the miracle of moving out of oneself. For Levinas, an escape from the self requires God. Cavell, on the other hand, insists that all it takes to move out of yourself is another human being in front of you. I say, he writes, you don't need the idea of God to achieve the miracle of moving out of yourself, but only an investment of a certain kind in a particular finite other, one in which you suffer the other's separation, perhaps by allowing that the other knows who you are, perhaps by forgiving him for not knowing. The investment in a particular finite other that Cavell talks about presupposes a kind of reciprocity, an ability to acknowledge the perspective of the other, who is other just because he or she is separate. This is the kind of otherness that Beauvoir will go on to discuss in Pyrrhus and Cineas and in The Blood of Others, for example. But Françoise never reaches this stage. This is why Françoise is not an ethical or political agent, and it's why L'Invité is absolutely not a political novel. What interests Beauvoir is Françoise's consciousness and its encounter with absolute otherness. This is why L'Invité embodies the metaphysical novel in its purest form. Thank you.
Take some time for some questions before we break for drinks, which
I know that, didn't you promise, was it Chablis you promised?
I did, but there's been a mix-up and we have to slum it with Matt will do that.
I'm just teasing Bill here. So of course I'd love to have some questions if anyone wants to say something.
When you said right at the beginning, when the author likes to engage with the reader, to me it sounded like a kind of an impossible thing to do, because the reader is not one, but it's one of many in a set with different propensities, backgrounds, knowledge, etc. So when you say that you are trying to engage, how can this be done really? This was a problem to me, to see how you can engage with the reader when it's not a specific, so to speak.
Well, I think that what I was quoting was Beauvoir's idea that a novel is an invitation to the reader to follow the writer on an adventure of a genuine adventure of the mind. And I think she's thinking of reading in a fairly sort of phenomenological, existential sense, is that each one of us, when we pick up a book, obviously we are totally different, you're right about that. We come from all kinds of places and walks of life with different ages and all this. But when we pick up a book, that book is there as an invitation to us to see, can I follow this adventure? Can I go along with that? Maybe you can't. Maybe you will throw the book away saying, I've never read anything, I cannot get on with that. But then, as it were, the author's invitation remains. Maybe some other reader can make something of it. But this is not about sociology, whereby we could possibly do all kinds of empirical studies to find out what types of readers are more likely to follow Beauvoir and so on. But that's not what she's interested in. She's interested in each one of us engagement. And this is what happens whenever you pick up a book. It makes claims on you. It asks you to read it in a special way, and sometimes it's written. See, that's why I was saying there are two ways you can fail. The book can fail you. You are trying to pick up the invitation, but it really doesn't pay off, and then you may give it up, or you may not persevere for long enough, as it were. So it can go both ways.
Any other questions?
questions whatsoever. I think this Macron village seems to be more attractive than discussion. Oh
The
well.
consequence of the whiteboarding having been put out. It's too enticing. What we could do in that case, of course, ask further questions, but informally over the lesson.
This would also be wonderful.
Or something else. So shall we do that now? And can we thank Toril once again for